Hello everyone, today we talk about the decline of cavalry on European battlefields during the Renaissance, fundamentally. So we will basically discuss just a few things um, from the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. And I think this is interesting because, as you know, if you have followed me also recently when I answered some questions via video, that had been posed on, late medieval infantry. I fundamentally do specialize actually in early 14th century warfare, and specifically the rise of communal and peasant infantries at that time. And there is this, and I, at least this is my opinion now, we can't discuss it today, that there, of course, by the mid 14th century, this progress was stopped. That is to say, the societies that produced those infantries basically were cut down, either by crisis or properly by the nobility, and that is probably the moment of creation of what we know as the ancient regime, of the ancien regime, that basically would last, right, in its probably more stereotypical way, up to the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century, which is a perspective that is often misunderstood. I guess I think in the West we've been told the story as a sort of progressive linear growth, right? It goes from the Middle Ages, were kind of the darkest moment, right? And then eventually during the modern age things were kind of always better gradually. Well, for the lower strata of the situation, it wasn't actually like that. In the peak of feudal times, the peasantry was much freer than it was, say, during the 16th century. But this is also another topic. So I say this because most of the times I like to stress that cavalry, the knights, the aristocracy, kept its retained fundamentally its control, its power in the late Middle Ages, right? That, and the most difficult thing to understand at that point is that the rise of infantries that restarts specifically and not gradually from the early 14th century, but basically in accelerated form from the mid 15th century on the Swiss example, in its copy and eventually surpassing during the wars of Italy from the side of the major powers in Europe at the time, is not a progressive improvement of, let's say, an anthropological conception of the commoners from the side of the aristocracy, or let's say even properly the social improvement of the same. That is, that the soldiers we see at that point are not an agent of the people. They are agents of the monarchs that were at that point trying to centralize power, the even modern state, to counter specifically the nobility. So what we see in today we talk mostly about the Italian wars, roughly as a background, but not even so specifically. But what we see there as, the Swiss are a bit a tricky example, because there you have a confederacy. So you have something very different from the princely states that are emerging in Europe as style monarchies, basically, at that point. And in fact, it's a model that, albeit path opening, it was, since Marignano, basically surpassed by other infantries, and namely, as it would be for basically 200 years, mostly by the Spanish ones, by the Tercio, and a bit that would have a dramatic impact even in the military culture of the time, in terms of also of the view of surely of the infantryman per se, but also of the nobleman as a foot combatant. Right, so surely there was an improvement in the idea that even an infantryman could achieve something more that had been done before, right? But still, first of all, this happens, as in all military history, with a surpassing of individual capacity. That is to say, infantrymen are not good because they are individually this big deal, but because together, information as a mass with a brutal training, for which just a much richer guy that basically owns this guy can invest, they can become stronger than the sum of the individuals, right? That is what individual fighters cannot do. And that's civilizational accomplishment. That's properly the surpassing of the warrior culture that by definition it declares its military inferiority. If you think that you can, you know, uh, basically cope with war at political and social level by investing on something so ridiculously fragile as your own body or your own individual, skill, etc., as a warrior ideally thought of, right? And this is what the same chivalry learned the hard way in these contexts, mostly during the Italian wars. And in fact, if you look at the 16th century warfare, you have basically the moment, especially towards the mid of the century, of maximum contraction of cavalry importance on European battlefields. Basically, yes, in absolute terms, and literally up to the end of the 19th century, proper. That is to say, in the 17th century, cavalry would start coming back, right? Whereas in mid-16th century, cavalry was not abandoned. Like, heavy cavalry was always there. And it was always there because also the nobility was always there. But a lot of things were changing properly in the same composition of cavalry. There were many factors that was bringing in there the same nobility to that would be more evident later on with Louis XIV's absolutism, this, say, creation of nobility that it could be also a sword one, but still framed into a state that at this point had a few to do, at least as concretely with what had been before in terms of just a sum of different communities properly, started being centralized under the control of a monarch, right? Still the idea is that the monarch owns the kingdom, so it's a private aristocratic business. But more concretely, it's properly absolutism that allowed for the rise of the middle classes, of the bourgeois, that would bring eventually to the bloodiest revolutions later on, which are still a measure of modernity. Sometimes here, I don't know, if we like the Middle Ages, it's easy to get fascinated with the figures of monarchs, of nobility or aristocracy. I instinctively, we are more sympathetic towards the warrior, the individualism, etc. We're programmed like that by evolution. But civilization is counterintuitive, counterinstinctive, and it teaches us that that simply gets surpassed, and that the same modernity, albeit by many surely seen as in a way as the rise of mediocrity, right? It's still actually a very a radically effective and successful political and strategical accomplishment, right? Because through that, societies are stronger and more effective, capable of wiping out enemies, and this still kind of say more individualistic and privatistic, and at the end of the day, less just order that existed before, right? The past was no better than today, but we also have to understand there was a reason why it was at the time, and this is often misunderstood because you have to study history to do that. So you have to have the courage to go against the cliches and whatever you think you makes you feel comfortable reading or learning. So today I also talk about the decline of cavalry, and how to discuss this is not easy, because we gotta admit that, of course, since the last two centuries of the Middle Ages, chivalry had entered in crisis. I mean, there is no doubt that what happened on the European battlefields of the first half of the 14th century had shaken once for all, because it was a moral shock, right? It was something that was shown, was learned, right? That also knights can be butchered by scum, right? That is worth nothing, and that is evidently meaning that scum is not worth nothing, right? Especially when they're many and angry and they have a point, right? Such as this history of oppression and ferocity that surely the aristocracy did maintain throughout all this, and its reaction is was in fact very, very dramatic. If anything, also because it was a bit like from their own side the declaration of their own inferiority, which could not be properly accepted, right? Today, we are born and raised in realities that have thought that had make us properly forget what the world was like before. Today we have an idea of equality, of human rights, etc. This world here, you got that's why you got to understand it, had never known anything like that before. And not only it was filled with a completely different principle. That is to say that there were people that by birth were intrinsically superior to others under any point of view. It was a a proto-racial ideal there. The nobleman was considered as a superior human being, or properly a full human being, than a peasant was considered basically just something better than an animal, right? And for that reason, they thought it was right that God had created this hierarchy, that these people were meant to lead. And as long as aristocracy was in charge, objectively, it was because for those time standards, albeit in a mobster-like way, it objectively had the capacity to control things and to make them even evolve at their own expenses, right? The rise of the cities, of the countries, etc., was merit of the old feudal elite, because those were the ones that had the capitals, who invested in things and made things grow. The same goes, as I was saying before, in another scale with absolutism, right? Why France, the most absolutistic and more completely so country par excellence, is also the one where the bloodiest revolution happened. Right? There are many reasons. There's no determinism either, right? The French Revolution may have not happened, at least specifically not in that way, but surely there is a connection, and it's not much different connection from the one that you see, with the Jacquerie during the 14th century. And the parallelism there between the 100-Year Wars and the French participation to the American Revolution, for that matter, in terms of military expenses, albeit with different outcome, at least at the moment, at that specific moment. So how did nobiliar chivalry, knighthood, react in front of the rise in importance and of military prestige of infantry? The military prestige also is to understand here, because as we were saying before, even when seen also, we're making that video about the Landsknecht, and in fact we're about to name now, in terms of properly who had to pay for these guys. They were still a nobiliar creation, right? So this prestige was also very political in a propagandistic sense, right? It's not that Maximilian of Habsburg actually cared much about the individual Landsknecht that he hired, right? Surely he had a political interest to make him follow him, and to pay him, especially because they weren't there for him either. Right, and let's also be honest about this. The lowest strata of society are by far the most radically violent, disorderly, and dangerous of all community. There is no doubt that it's always been true, right? It's just that, fortunately for that reason, they often lack the moral capacities, not primarily the material ones. Those are not so important as we think, but probably the moral ones to actually do something by themselves. In fact, as this example proves as well, they were brought they were brought to rise because they were properly made so by someone else, just like the 18th, 19th, 20th century revolutions. It's never the mass, it's somebody that leads them, right? That is at the upper level. The first reaction was a sort of entrenchment behind a contemporary class, status, rank, pride. For example, when Maximilian of Habsburg proposed that it was a great esteemer of pikemen in his political military project, right, at the siege of Padua in 1509, had suggested the knights to take part in their turn to the assault of walls, so storming on the walls next to the infantrymen, the proud Bayard, the Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche, one of the greatest men of arms of his times, answered, because he served the Habsburgs. He fought in Italy for them, he fought at Guinegate. You find, if you look at his military curriculum, you cannot but bow, right? That was a true knight, in the truest sense possible, right? In fact, he answered haughtily that the noblemen cared, too highly of their honor to mix themselves with shoemakers, farriers, and mechanics, right? And here you have to understand properly what it meant, right? Here, of course, Bayard was French. It was also a bit more, haughty than by tradition. This kind of national stereotype of French cavalry is the flower of European cavalry tradition, etc. But properly there was a sense of pride for themselves. That is to say, a knight would understand the difference it made at the time between him and an infantryman, right? Because surely a knight could always do what an infantryman could do. And this is often forgotten in a military historical perspective. But an infantryman cannot do what a knight can do. And this answer, now I don't remember now exactly the details of the situation, but it's particularly fascinating because in my research I came across something that is pretty much known to medieval warfare. That is to say that knights often fought on foot, but properly, especially like in that situation as we've seen here, that they would take the lead normally as stormtroopers in the storming of the walls, right? In the Middle Ages, would you think that actually stormed walls normally, the commoners? Like, do you have an idea of the psychophysical strength that it takes to storm, to climb properly a wall and to open, your way among the ranks of somebody who's up there, who had all the advantage in gravity and speed, Noblemen did that, right? They were supported, of course, by crossbowmen, by other troops, etc., but they were the leaders, right? They were in sieges like they were in pitched battles, right? It's just now that war had changed by 1509 with the Habsburgs fighting in Italy. When you storm a wall, now pikemen, the infantry is designed also to do so. Why? Because now these guys are not just some militia there. These guys now are professionals of war. That is also properly what makes the difference altogether in the progress of modern warfare, right? It will take a long time for it to happen, but still the idea that the core of the troops here would be made up of professional infantrymen was something very new for medieval standards. And that's why we are in the Renaissance now, even though somebody, of course, it doesn't make any sense. Nobody knew it at the time. For me, the Middle Ages stopped either in 1789 or in 1918, for that matter. If you really want to explain it from a military point of view, right? So this is crucial to understand. So that's why Bayard's answer, that is the one of a mercenary himself, is truly honest, it's truly genuine. That is to say, the guy literally thought that infantrymen were scum, right? They were inferior, that there was a honor that a knight owned that couldn't allow him to get mixed with that rabble, right? And of course, it's the history of Bayard is the history of this dramatic tragedy, this tragic ending. Bayard, as you know, was killed actually in combat by an arquebus shot, not on that occasion, but still Italian wars, in his back, right? He embodies the symbol of the death of the knight in Renaissance warfare, right? And he got his back broken by the arquebus shot, and he realized he was dying. So while still in the field, he told his comrades to put him against a tree, sitting, so that he would still stand with his back even if it was broken, and facing towards the enemy, to prove that do you understand what it means now, right? Also, to prove the enemy, he would always stand, right, over them, like the knight that he was, right? These are men whose motivations, whose individual capacity, we will never be able to cope, to properly to replicate, to own as our own again, right? For better and for worse, actually, maybe more for the best in general. But these were men that had this huge sense of themselves because they had deserved. If you look again at all the battles that guy participating to, that kind of respect, because there was in the society they had been grown, that naturally was changing, but they were loaded with a positive political and social responsibility for their role to prove on the field as well. So here we are in front of kind of very neat revival, right? Today we can say even a sort of chivalry, of reflux of chivalry, right? As we were saying before, in the 2 previous centuries, much had already happened about that. If you think about the 100 Years' War, the same knights had often fought dismounted, right? The English are most famous, but the French did the same. There isn't actually that kind of dichotomy, like the French were always fine. No, things were much more similar than they seemed, right? And also, especially, there is a military logic that is often misunderstood. That is to say, the English didn't win their battles because they fought on foot, right? That's not the reason, right? Nor the French conversely lost because they fought on horseback. Also because, in fact, they didn't sometimes. It's one of the most important times, look, as in Corps, etc. But aside from that, so it was not a matter of fighting on foot or dismounted or not, right? As we have seen, it was a matter of social prestige, and it's just like a modern mentality. We fail to understand that usually. It wasn't much about the technicality of the war capacity. It was properly knowing what you embodied as a trooper, right? And what is important to stress, as I was saying at the beginning, is that this view, by the mid-14th century, say, was very appropriate because the feudal chivalric world, even if it was in crisis, right, it was evident in a way, it still seemed well, steady in its reality. We're well solid, we're stable, right? This couldn't be instead by the 16th century. Exactly, in fact, because that world now was being liquidated on the level of the structural incidents on society, and it was, ever more spasmodically grasping, right, remaining attached to its privileges and to the forms of its past supremacy. I stress it, it's not society in the sense of, once again, the commoners being much stronger than before. It's properly the monarchies being much stronger than before and using infantrymen as an arm to counter what had been the arm of chivalry par excellence, that is, cavalry. This is also very instructive because it makes you understand how very often there is, like, I think half of the Western world is obsessed with the idea of tyranny, right, for very specific historical reasons and cultural reasons the countries were spread. This is not exactly how it works. Normally, what we call as the tyrants are actually the greatest friends of the people, right? The greatest opponents of the people are actually the oligarchies, which is a completely different thing. It is to say, the single guy at the top who wants to get rid of this imposing, powerful aristocrats that try to counter his rise, right? And he allies with the lowest strata of the population, because he, of course, doesn't give a damn about them either. There is no humanitarian principle behind it, but sheer, realpolitik logics of, power and of control. And they tend to improve the also the integration of different elements in the statal machine to counter the aristocratic read, in this context especially, kind of more privatistic element in it. That naturally normally goes against the development of a solid public culture, authority, education, etc. But later on, also this phase would have been surpassed. Let's say that firearms naturally have an important role in this broader phenomenon because infantries were now evidently about this combined pike and shot tactics that was, albeit very slowly, but still effectively now coming to a fixing. Like properly, that Gonzalo de Cordoba, if you don't know who he was, like he's literally the single most important commander in modern warfare. Like he actually invented modern warfare. It's that the Spanish at the Battle of Cerignola for the first time fully integrate, right, in what would remain basically till the end of Pike-Shot era, the balance between pikes and shots, in fact, and halted dramatically the French cavalry, and pretty bloodily so, to maintain that, to properly render it useless in many ways. And that combination, as you know, would be dominant on the battlefields ever since, and not just in Europe, right? The Russians, conquered Siberia with that, because the Tartars basically were puzzled by that tactics, and there was simply no way they could get they could, resolve themselves. But what impacted here, as before, was the moral dimension, because chivalry had de facto, with these defeats in the early 16th century, definitively lost its fame of invincibility. This had never been lost, right? Nor the infantries of the early 14th century, nor the 100 Years' War, whatever, had made anybody say, well, okay, then we shouldn't fight with cavalry anymore, or cavalry is useless, or it's not even important, or, we will arrive at a point where we won't need it anymore. Nobody had ever thought that. If you read the sources, if you read what was happening there, there was an awareness of what was going on, but nobody was thinking like, something so silly to say, okay, let's get rid of cavalry, right? Because not even here properly it was done. In fact, there is an important aspect to stress properly. Here it's the fame. You see, it's where we talk about moral forces in the Clausewitzian theory. You have to force the enemy, to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, right? It's not a matter of literally knocking out the guy. It happens, like we see that in military practice, this does pass through the physical annihilation of the enemy forces. That is a bath of blood. But first of all, you have to force this guy to simply surrender and accept anything that you want. So the moral dimension, the motivation, the determination had been of cavalry, of knighthood itself, had been shattered, right? And its prestige was not tied, by the way, just to the purely military outcome. For example, the horses at this point began to cost too much, right? Because of the better missile, in fact, firearms on the field in the late Middle Ages, there is an increasing specialization between the ultra heavy cavalry and like the skirmishing one, including with guns sometimes, and knights fought with naturally the heaviest breeds with this dramatic, imposing plate armor, upright, and etc. And naturally, the horse had to be a much beefier beast, right? And they costed a freaking lot, right? At the point, they started to say, okay, but these knights, also mercenarism was out there because these guys needed to make a living, right? And when the instruments, etc., the horses, it starts costing too much, you say, well, but what am I fighting for? Just to insist with this? No, of course, there's a practicality. So the same knights begin to rethink that kind of formula, right? Always remember that if there is somebody here that understands warfare, are knights, in absolute terms, right? As long as they're the elite, they will remain for a long time. So, I mean, from a social point of view, they are the guys that also literally have their own companies, order their own infantrymen. They have infantrymen themselves, right? So they are the best guys that have always known historically that infantry has the potential and probably the practical effect it has. The myth that knights at some point underestimated infantry force from a technical point of view is one of the greatest myths in the history of warfare. Right? That didn't happen because they didn't know what an infantryman could do. It's just that because there's something called fog of war, that especially when nobody has ever, tried, when you have some enemies in front of you that you have never tried properly yet, it's not easy to understand how things will go, right? And knights always employ the best tactics against infantry. It's a myth that they had to work technically or intellectually deficient to charge into, hell traps because they were too stupid or too haughty to accept, right? This is a dramatic underestimation of proper medieval intelligence that is by far dramatically more advanced altogether than what most single people are mentally today, and surely you're not more intelligent or more capable than a medieval knight of 1,000 years ago, by any stretch of the imagination. But the proper point is that they had always, in this sense, respected the potential of infantry. They had always understood that they needed that for doing anything, because there's never been an army just of horsemen. Right, just in sedentary civilized society. It's always been about infantry the most, because that is needed to do a lot of other things, and those things have to do with fighting. It's not a mere logistical support or aid, whatever. No, those guys fought as hell, and then the knights knew it pretty damn well themselves. Also, another factor that had eroded, say, the capacity of cavalry in the field at this point in the Renaissance was that, let's say, properly by the same extraction. Like, there were lots of people that were joining the ranks of the horse that weren't noblemen themselves, because properly not all the horsemen were noblemen, while conversely the rank of knight, that is a warder of chivalric dignity, was by from much time something that was not directly nor necessarily connected to the effective mounted combat, right, to service on horseback. This is also very important to understand, because it's connected to the same awareness of the nobility that there wasn't just cavalry, nor that this cavalry had necessarily to be just composed of noblemen themselves. And once again, it's not about the technicality of warfare, it's about the prestige that noblemen have on a battlefield, right? And of course, when you have an army of big Pavia, I don't know, or the Saint Charignol that were sent before, right? You have there properly the spearhead of the core of your strength that is embodied by the nobility, that is defeated by non-noblemen. Well, at that point is really the loss of prestige. It's you have lost the glory of it all, and this is what those people fought exclusively for, in a way, because they really believed that the world revolved around that, and in part they were also right at the time. Also, in here, I will not digress, because naturally we mostly talk about Western Europe in here. I sometimes disappoint, many of my followers who would like already to space a bit more to Central or Eastern European history. But the question here is that, of course, the major developments in general, since the Middle Ages and before, in European warfare are Western European thing. There is nothing around this that can't be done. It's obvious that in Central Eastern Europe, these things took a much longer time to happen, right? And sometimes as east as even certain German regions, right, where feudality still maintained an important element in cavalry accordingly. right? But this is a too big, and not because it was a positive thing, but because literally they were the least advanced heirs that had least things to say in the first place in the international arena. So we will talk naturally about this at some point. We are here gradually covering part Renaissance warfare, a bit more slowly than medieval one, but still also from late medieval topics we can start approaching that, because 14th, 15th century warfare is also very fascinating already in a comparative European scale, right? As we were saying before, it was also another way that infantry had gained its glorious warlike aura through historically, and this happened mostly because of Spain. That is, the country was rising as the best military, qualitatively speaking, quantitatively speaking, because it was become basically the largest power in Europe. Literally, even aside from the sum of the Habsburg possessions in the empire, Spain, but properly, as we were saying before, for 200 years is the tercio that dictates the model of war, and is it is often overlooked even in later times. That is to say, certain reforms that you see happening, I don't know, among the Dutch, among the Swedes, etc., that are a bit taken paradigmatically. Look at the advancement. Pike-and-Shot evolution was something very gradual, non-linear even there, and especially it's not very well documented. And we know actually that certain things that were, march counter much of these things, were already being experimented pretty much everywhere. Sometimes we pick just a manual or a voice that says maybe, look at these guys were doing something, but we don't understand concretely what was happening in the field, whereas we find similar things happening, similar hints for other countries as well. At that point, the way of war was pretty universally, blending in together. Spain had, however, a different, as always, so if you want to understand any military thing, a different political social background, right? That brought many noblemen to serve as foot soldiers. Why? Well, this is a bit complicated to explain, to digress, and we'll make a video about this. The point is that like 1/3 of Spanish, so at that point of Castilian, I presume that the statistics was about, free men were hidalgos. That is, they were namely noblemen. This was a legacy of the Reconquista, right? They were, in most cases, not better than a gentry, right, like they were in other countries, but still, the idea of nobility, of chivalry, that was all imbued in the sense of the Reconquista, of the eternal struggle against the Moors, etc. It's also what we'll feel, the pride and arrogance and confidence of the conquistadores, of these same commanders and soldiers in the Italian wars from Italy to Flanders and so on, is the idea that Spain had managed to make war in a very consistent fashion that is often a bit sui generis, meaning that Spain is a bit a thing on its own, objectively, and I guess this transition here from medieval to Renaissance warfare shows a little bit. Also for certain typologies of warfare, etc. But they were the first ones that managed to integrate the pike and shot arms in an effective way for the first time. Naturally, it's also because they were very rich, right? And that's and because they had a hierarchy, they had properly a dynastic union that allowed these enormous funds to be spent. Then eventually, more so with the medals from the Americans, etc. But I mean, I don't have to tell you the story, right? That allowed to pay for properly professional troopers. They also were all voluntary. Namely, this is quite fascinating, and that spread this culture, this idea, for which naturally these hidalgos, if 1/3 of the male population is noblemen, it's obvious that you won't have, they won't all be knights at all, properly even in the technical capacity of combat. So this translated itself in the fact that noblemen in these armies fought mostly on foot. Right, and that therefore it wasn't a shame. It was not, a shame to for it to be, especially when these armies began to win, and began to win against the ultra-heavy, super cool, aristocratic cavalry, such as the French one. We've seen that Spanish fashion, even in the equipment, etc., spread. In that video we made about the Landsknechten, we have seen that some of the most typical Landsknechten thing is actually of Spanish influence. Because at the time they cared about this stuff, and it was connected, ideally symbolically, with this prestige acquired, in that case with infantries that now were kind of imitating all each other, and especially the most winning model. In Spain there was also in parallel the entry into use noblemen fighting on foot, which was not unknown, as we've seen, not even if you think about the steps of arms and all that things, but still more, more structured way. And even in a short while, the season of the duels of peones swordsmen, that is to say commoners, that literally fought with the sword, part of the entertaining these tournaments, etc. And as you know, that was also a thing because okay, just think about the double-handed swordsmen, their role like in pike, in anti-pike warfare, all these things, whatever. We'll see it better another time. And naturally, it was very bitter for noblemen to swallow this matter of, especially firearms, that would take down the flower of chivalry, right? And that was still celebrated in the Renaissance epos and ethos. About this, I would say that, you see, it's a bit like the story of the bow or the crossbow that were considered as vile and insidious weapons, right? I've studied a little bit the thing for the Middle Ages, a bit from the close, and I must say that is actually a literary cliché. Right, not just because obviously every nobleman knew how to use a bow. If anything, because when they didn't make war, they were out there hunting, which is also basically doing the same thing. And at least from a technical point of view, when those weapons were involved, the same goes for crossbows actually. Whereas the practice of warfare was always much more, unprejudiced than we think. So here, in the Renaissance, when we can hear literally more strongly the echo of this complaint for those damn firearms, we are not literally listening to much of a nobiliar prejudice against firearms per se, but rather the voice of the most important political elements of the time. They were caught unprepared by this, and that thought it to be unfair, for naturally also for their ethos. Surely they believed, it's obvious that it's kind of cowardly to, even today, but if somebody aggresses you from the to, let's say, close combat, you feel more engaged in the sense that it's as if it was fairer than if it shot you at a distance, right? It's still a shared feeling. Even a peasant would have thought the same way about firearms, for that matter. But surely it was more about not the single firearm or the technology in itself, but mostly about the mass of these men now that were really creating imposing barrages of fire on the battlefields and creating pretty serious problems at many levels to knights, but also any other trooper alike. And it was the idea naturally that the hero now would and it's all the combat rules that revolved around him would be surpassed by somebody that would be morally so. There is a beautiful passage from the Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto that, together with Shakespeare and Cervantes, literally created modernity from a literary point of view in Western civilization. That is a beautiful, witty, also, not just serious, work that documents this crisis even properly a moral crisis of chivalry itself, that sounds something so that no, so speaking of firearms specifically, so I'm translating kind of simultaneously, so that the knight may not be less bold, let's say, nor to be in fact worse than it is, but nor that the guilty, the coward, could boast to be more. I throw you away. O cursed or abominous device, fabricated in the bottom of Tartarus, you wear by the hand of the devil. The word drew a ruin because of you, right? In the waves of hell from which you came out, I will throw you back. And these are the words that Ariosto puts on the lips of Orlando himself while he's about to throw, again in the sea, the arquebus of the vile Chimosco. Right, that is a bit, here we'll see an interesting figure. So condemning harshly, naturally, this devilish character of the of the arquebus, because of many reasons. Actually, there even here are in folklore connected to, I don't know, the sulfur, for example, as the smell of the devil, right? And this is not just in Europe. Like, for example, the Tartars were, very, they had this kind of similar prejudice, for example, towards the acquisition of firearms. It's interesting how this is declining in different countries in Europe themselves, right? For example, France, well, seemingly lacked, an important chance to exploit this, to exploit firearms, exactly because of the political and social weight of the nobility. It would refuse equipping troops like that. It could be able to cut down ever more cavalry in the same France, right? It was a fear, an actual, there was a huge political debate around this, also the necessity to establish even just infantry corps, right? We made that video last summer, I think, about French infantry of the Italian wars, that tells a story of a final success, but it took like 200 years to properly start to work since the 100 Years' War. And because if France, with its dramatic demographic and agricultural resources, had wanted to field masses of men equipped with firearms, it would have easily overwhelmed even the Habsburgs, right? It would have won the wars of Italy. Instead, it didn't quite, for part of this prejudice. And so never underestimate this, so that the prejudice takes on a political meaning. It's not about it's not about the limits of individual intelligence. It's like literally struggling with a cost for maintaining grip on society, which is something very different from what happens on the field, but surely reflects itself on it at the same time. So compared to bow and crossbow, the firearm found a new symbolically negative datum, in the fact to have to do naturally with that element that, as the verses of the Orlando Furioso kind of point out, the nouns qualified it as diabolical, as infernal, right? Because of the chemical of it, side of it, or also these substances came from the earth, were not the Apollonian, let's say, symbology of the night angel, etc. It's something dark, it's something produced. Also the same firearm, the same metal, that this thing was connected to the world of the smiths, of these creatures, equated almost to the midgets of working in caves, extracting metals, having these connections with the underworld, mysteries and demons and so on. And there is a specific trait here about Chimosco in the aforementioned passage, because Chimosco is the king of Frisia in the work, right? And Ariosto's verses give us, in this sense, a very pregnant actuality in the measure in which at the time, many arquebusiers actually came de facto from that area corresponding to the modern Netherlands. And there is also that Frisia also was historically, one of those areas that had seen infantry victories of commoners, etc. Not with much further, expansion, but still enough to be mentally, historically, one of the most independent-minded areas in Europe, right? And historically so, and maybe it's by coincidence, or by this strange irony of fate, that also this passionate complaint of the new times and the new diabolical instruments was rising with Ariosto from that same Ferrarese court of princes that were famous producers of cannons. The Este and Ferrara produced renownedly some of the best artillery in Europe, right? And Ariosto is also very, as we were saying before, comical, witty, right? So this is a bitter remark about artillery and denounce, etc. But the whole tone of the work is to show a bit the world upside down, and in a way that is real. It is the typical Renaissance spirit, right? We think of the Renaissance as something shiny, happy, progressive. No, it was one of the most radically traumatic moments in the history of Western civilization. It was the moment, like the Reformation, the discoveries of the new worlds. People got lost. Like for one century, even with Baroque, the impression was that there was no center anymore, that Europeans had to learn to understand the world again once from scratch. And artillery did play a part in this, right? And especially with the booming of wars at that point on unprecedented scale, right, in Europe. And Bayard's death, as we were saying before, is a bit the well-readable and decipherable symbol, right, that gives value to this context, to this background. The flower of early 16th century chivalry, the gentle, brave, and a bit obtuse Bayard at some point, but that's an ingenuous portrait, let's say, to fall in 1523, as we've seen before, by an arquebus shot. And that is frightening, right? This is the frightening process of the times that would lead to a very different way of war, right? It's just that things happen slowly. Not so slowly not to notice them, like in this case, but slowly in a way that do not always are not always clear, not always evident, do not change society from a day to another, right? And that therefore there is somebody that opposes that, somebody who fights for it, somebody, and all this constant negotiation, as Clausewitz says, a bit like a business, a contract that is always at the base of politics, war, and society. Alright, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.